Hello again, it's me. Um, so today we're going to be talking about Chapter 3, which covers behavior change techniques, and this is from your textbook. Where is it? By Prestwich, Kenworthy, and Connor. Okay, so before we get going on to the lecture, so you will see that you have been assigned a new activity, a new assignment that is due in, I think it's due in 3 weeks. So you have time. No need to panic about it or get anxious over it. I did go into Canvas to see if you could see how I grouped you. So if you go, I will list it up anyway. I'll put an Excel sheet up for you. But for right now, if you want to know immediately who you've been grouped with for your particular group on this assignment, you can go to, in Canvas, on the left-hand column, you'll see that it says People. And so if you click on the People icon, it'll take you to the page where it lists all the students in your class. And then there on the top menu, you should be able to say something like, either it says groups, I believe it says groups, and then it tells you what kind of groups are paired together or grouped together. And if you hit the one that says PSA or PSA groups, I can't remember exactly what I named it, but there's a PSA in the name. If you click on there, then it'll throw you down into the different groups that I combined for this particular assignment. And so I think there's, it depends which class you're in. In one of the classes, I think there's 3 groups or 4 groups, and in the other class, there is multiple. There's maybe 7 groups, I think. So you can look there, but again, I'll post up the Excel sheet that has your specific groups so that you can have it handy and you don't have to go into the menu if you don't want to. I'm not going to do a tutorial yet on your assignment. What I want you to do first is I want all of you to go in and read the assignment. Just read to see if it makes sense to you. And then send me your questions by email. I won't respond to your questions by email. Instead, I'll try to consolidate all of them and then use them to create my tutorial for the assignment. So I can make sure I answer all your questions in the tutorial all at once, okay? So that means you'll have to come back in and make sure you view the video to make sure you get the answers to your questions. Okay, I just wanted to kind of go over that before we got started. I will be putting up an extra credit opportunity. And so I am giving a talk on health disparities and health equity this Friday. The talk is going to be live at 11 o'clock. I think it's from 11 to 12 Mountain Time. I've asked that it be recorded so I could make it available to the class as an extra credit opportunity. So you can go in and listen and write up your extra credit assignment. So I'll post that up in the near future. So whether you get to participate and see it live, or if you want to just wait and see the recording, you'll have a link to the recording and view it at a time that's convenient for you. I think that's it. Oh, the exam's going to come up. It's going to be available for, I think, 5 or 6 days. I can't remember what the time frame I put on there. But it'll be available to you, not this weekend, but through probably from Monday through Sunday of the next weekend. Not this weekend, the next weekend. Okay, so you'll have plenty of time to do it. If you work during the week, then you'll have the weekend to complete it. So for your exam, you have a weekly review in each of your Canvas modules. So if you haven't been keeping up with those or looking at them, I would encourage you to go in and look at what the review is asking you to focus on for the exam. I encourage you to kind of address all the components in the reviews and be ready for your exam. It'll help you prepare mentally and think about it. And then um, once you start the exam, so on the day that you decide you're ready, you can take it any day during the 1 week. Once you start the exam, you have to complete it within a 2.5 hour period. So there's a high potential you will not have time to go and look up every answer. So it is open book, it's open notes, it's open everything. But the exam is not meant to test your memory of things. It's more a test of your ability to apply what you have learned in this class. So the test is all multiple choice, true, false type of questions. And but you will be asked in those questions to apply what you've learned in the class, and it's not just a memory of a definition or something. It's application of the material you're learning and applying it to a specific situation in some cases. Okay, so be prepared, be familiar, review your lectures, review your notes. If you completed the review and have answers to all of those items, or can address each of those items in the review, then you'll be ready for the exam. Okay? Make sure your computer's working. Make sure you have good connectivity, and make sure that you have the 2.5 hours to sit and dedicate to your exam before you open it. Okay? Once you open it, you have to finish. Okay? I will not reopen the exam for you. So be ready. Okay? Make sure you prep well before you go in and take that exam. Okay, so let's get back to lecture. So chapter 3 is covering behavior change techniques. So up to now, we've been talking about the different theories, right? The different behavior change theories and all the constructs that are believed to determine behavior change. So in this textbook, when they're talking about the constructs, they're referring to them as determinants, the determinants of behavior, right? And so in the other book, we're talking about behavior change constructs. And in many of the articles, they call them constructs. But this book kind of uses a little bit different language. And so just know that when they're talking about the determinants, they're talking about the different theory-based constructs, okay? Let's see, what did I want to... So this chapter is really targeting how are we going to influence or affect those theoretical constructs, those psychological determinants, right, that influence human behavior. And so this book provides you with a variety of behavior change techniques. It gives you a laundry list of 26 type of techniques, but know that there's many, many more. And it even makes reference to Michie's most recent list of behavior change techniques, which include up to, I think, 90 plus different techniques to target these different psychological constructs that we believe influence behavior. Let's see. Okay, so let's go on and see what they have to say. Okay, so they talk about the behavior change taxonomies, and all this means that this is the different names, right? The nomenclature for each behavior change technique that has been identified and classified in the literature. The taxonomy captures the description of the technique. It captures what is being done to the individual to try to influence the way they think about the behavior or their ability to carry out the behavior. Okay, so the name, this taxonomy, these behavior change taxonomies, sorry, I'm stuttering today, are very important because they help us create clear categories of techniques, right? Clear techniques of what is involved in this specific technique. It gives it a name, it gives it a definition, right? So by defining what they are, by classifying them and defining them, then it helps us in testing them, right? It's like, oh, what does this technique consist of? Well, it consists of X, Y, Z. Okay, so if you're doing these things, then you're engaging in this specific behavior change technique. Okay, let's see, what else did they have to say? So each behavior change technique, the name and the description has to be clear, right? So that we can understand how different approaches are influencing behavior or the way we think about behavior. Some of you said, well, some of these behavior change techniques, they sound almost identical to me. Like I can't distinguish between this one and this one and this one. And so the problem, I think a little bit of the problem is maybe like common words that are used to define the different techniques. So like you might see that many of the techniques have the word encourage in as part of their definition, and maybe that leads to a little bit of confusion. But I ask you to go in and read it carefully from beginning to end. Don't just get stuck on that first word, but read what the whole technique involves, okay? Even though it's encouraging something, the different techniques might be encouraging different things, okay? Let's see, what else did I want to cover here? So these clear, distinct techniques help us to be able to conduct research, to examine their effectiveness, right? So if we're all blurry in our definitions, then, it's hard to research that, right? It's like, isn't this the same as that? Kind of like what some of you were saying. And because some of the names might sound so similar to many different people that they end up categorizing their behavior change techniques in the wrong category or under the wrong name, right? And so it's really important for us to be clear and aware of exactly what the behavior change technique is implying that we do in order to engage the person in influencing the way they think about a behavior or their psychological constructs, right? Or those psychological determinants, as this book refers to them. And if everybody's using the same definition and categorizing or classifying them in the same way, their behavior change techniques in the same way, then we'll be able to compare across studies that applied the same behavior change techniques. Let's see, what else? Identify the most effective behavior change techniques. So it also helps us, if we're doing this correctly, it also helps us to identify more accurately which are the most effective behavior change techniques. And if you read through the whole book, I know they give you some clues as to what the best behavior change techniques are. Okay, let's see. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything. No, I think that was good on that. I had lots of notes on that one, but I remembered most of what I wanted to say on it. Okay, let me make sure I'm talking loud enough so you can hear. My throat is hurting a little bit, so I'll try to make sure I'm speaking clearly. And if not, you should know that when I post my PowerPoints up for you to review on your own, independent of the video or recording, you should know that each slide has notes under it. So if you missed or could not hear something I said, it's probably described to some extent in the notes section of the slide. Okay? All right. So how do we know, right, if a behavior change technique was effective? So what if you're using a study that has 2 behavior change techniques? Because it's never the case that we only apply one behavior change technique, right? If we're targeting multiple constructs, typically we're using techniques to address each different construct in our behavior change theory. And so then how do you know which behavior change technique was effective, right? And so if you're not looking at the constructs, but you're only looking at the technique, the behavior change technique that you applied, they really recommend doing a factorial design. And all that means is that for each combination of techniques in your study that you have, there should be a subgroup addressed to that specific combination. So for example, here in our table, assume that we are conducting an intervention that has two behavior change techniques. One technique would be to use motivational messaging, and then the other one would be to use implementation intention. Okay, so those are our two techniques. And so one is just, hey, let's give you a message to motivate you to change your behavior. And the other one is let's help you plan, right? How you're going to implement the behavior change. And so this would require that you do 4 groups of participants in your study so that you could compare across all of them to see what worked, what didn't work. Okay, so assuming that one group got both the implementation intervention and the motivational messaging, as implied here by yes to getting technique B and yes to getting technique A, right? So here they have both of the intervention strategies, both of the behavior change techniques incorporated. This one group is going to get both of these things. The other group is only going to get implementation intention type of behavior change technique implemented. And then another group is only going to get motivational messaging, nothing else as their intervention. And then a fourth group is going to get absolutely no change, no behavior change technique, no nothing. They're just the control group for comparison. Okay, and by doing this, then you can compare. Was implementation intention effective by itself? You would know because your group would show that, yes, from pre-test to post-test, they showed some kind of change in their behavior or the way they thought about the behavior. Or maybe they didn't show any effect, right? Implementation intention by itself had no effect. You could say the same thing for this group, right? Either the motivational messaging by itself had an effect or no effect, but you could determine that. And then you would look at this group. And the implementation intention plus the motivational messaging, was it stronger than either one alone? Did it have a stronger effect on behavior change than either alone? Or by combining them, did you actually cancel out their effects? And so that by using both of these techniques, it actually had a negative impact on your participants, kind of wiping out any behavior change effects. Okay, so I mean, you can imagine all sorts of scenarios. But by including the 4 groups, right, for each one, you are able to examine what worked, what didn't work, and did a combination of techniques serve you better or worse in trying to promote behavior change. And then you also always want to control a control group included with no behavior change technique incorporated, just to make sure that changes in behavior aren't occurring naturally without any intervention, right? So you always want to see that any group that receives some kind of behavior change technique was actually more effective in changing behavior than the group that got absolutely no intervention. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. So we must test every possible combination and its effect of intervention. And so the yes, no just means, was that technique used? Okay, it's not saying yes, there were effects, or no, there were no effects. It's just like, was it included? Yes. In these 2 groups, motivational messaging was included. And implementation intention was included, yes, in these two groups. And then you see where they were not included. Okay. All right. Let's see. I think I captured everything that I have listed here on the slide. Let's go on to our next slide. Okay, so Abraham and Michi developed a taxonomy of behavior change techniques. So I started abbreviating behavior change with BC, in case you're confused what BC is. Okay. And so if you refer to burning issue box number 3, you'll see all the techniques that they listed for changing behaviors of individuals and groups. And so make sure you're familiar with the different techniques. Be able to distinguish between the different techniques. Given an example, let's see. Okay, I don't remember what else I had, what my notes here are for. Maybe I started modifying my slides and I left some old notes. So in the book, they list 26 different behavior change techniques, but in more, that was from 2008, but the new revised version has a list of 93 behavior change techniques, and they're kind of grouped into 19 clusters. Or major categories. So these taxonomies of behavior change techniques will help you summarize findings across different studies, like we said before, and determine which techniques are effective in changing behavior or what type of behaviors they are effective with. Okay, I think effective for. So are they effective for alcohol use, but not with exercise? So you want to kind of, you would go and examine the literature to see, okay, what behavior change techniques are used with what kind of behaviors, and where are they found to be effective? So there's no magic map right here in this textbook. Many people go to the literature to kind of examine that. But in your module for this week, I did list the tool in the resources section of your module. You'll see 2 additional articles, and one is by Koch et al. From 2015. And this has a whole taxonomy of behavior change techniques and what constructs they are useful for targeting. Okay. So that one is kind of a cool little tool that you don't have to run to the literature. They've done some of the work for you. It might not include all the behavior change techniques, but it gives you a nice little description. Let's see, what else? So somebody asked about the difference between a systematic review and a meta-analysis. So a systematic review will go and look at the literature with predefined processes for selecting articles, like what articles do I want to include in my review. So that's defined in advance, and it guides how we go and identify and decide which articles we're going to include in our review. And then it also provides the steps for evaluating and even for synthesizing the research articles, okay, the information in those research articles. A meta-analysis does the same thing, but it takes it a step further. It's even more rigorous in that it includes statistics. It extracts statistics from each of the articles included in the review, and then it combines it and conducts additional statistical testing to see to identify what techniques worked and which ones didn't. Okay, and so the book listed a variety of meta-analysis in table 3.2 on page 52. And so it kind of tells you, like, we did a meta-analysis with all these behavior change techniques, trying to address physical activity and elderly, right? I mean, they usually define who their target population is. And then it tells you what they found. What did they summarize? How did they integrate the findings? And what did they conclude in terms of which behavior change techniques were effective for motivating the physical activity in the elderly? Okay, so that's a really cool table. I really like it. I think you should take a nice look at it. Spend some time with it. I know sometimes when we're reading, some people tend to skip over tables. Not in this class. Those tables are so informative. Okay, and so some questions might even come out from those tables. So be at least familiar with like which behaviors were targeted in these meta-analysis, what were the different subpopulations or groups that they were examining in relationship to that behavior, and which were the effective behavior change techniques. Excuse me. Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? Okay. So both the systematic review and the meta-analysis require that behavior change techniques be applied consistently. That just means that they be applied the same way across different researchers, across different research studies. And so if someone misinterpreted what a specific behavior change technique was supposed to be and they did it differently, then that's not a reliable application of that technique. Okay? So one thing is to really study up and to try, like if you're going to apply a specific behavior change technique, what is involved in that behavior change technique? Do your homework. Okay? Okay. So that's all they meant to say by reliable application, just that different people apply or interpret behavior change, misunderstand maybe what the behavior change technique is, and that's a problem, right? And so even when we have researchers trying to do these systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and they're going in and reviewing the articles and trying to identify, did they use this behavior change technique or this other one? They will have a coding system, right? Given this is what I think this behavior change technique is, and then I'll go look for it in the literature, and if I identify it, right, I'll do that with all the articles that I'm reviewing. But meanwhile, you have other researchers doing the exact same review. And what is the consistency across reviewers, right? It's like, one, it's important first that researchers be applying it consistently, but also it's important for the folks who are coding the articles to have the same definition and understanding of what the behavior change technique, so that they are coding similarly, right, and reliably, okay? So I know that's a lot of research jargon. We'll be talking about those type of things some more next semester. But for now, I'm more interested in you getting a grasp for how we go about trying to address or to target those psychological determinants or constructs in order to promote behavior change using the behavior change techniques listed in Chapter 3. Okay. So in figure 3.1, they kind of listed a variety of, I think they were also literature reviews. I can't remember now. Let me take a quick look. It was they just called it a review. They didn't say if it was meta-analysis or not. But I suspect if it was this degree of that they can identify it with this degree of influence, positive or negative, I suspect that maybe it was a behavior change technique. A meta-analysis, I'm sorry. So basically, in Figure 3.1, they were looking at a variety of interventions for healthy eating, and physical activity. And they wanted to identify which behavior change techniques were most effective based on the literature, what the researchers were finding in the literature. And so what they found was that the most effective behavior change technique for influencing physical activity or healthy eating was self-monitoring, right? So self-monitoring is a very important technique. I can understand why it's so important with our eating behavior, right? Because we do so much of our eating without really being very thoughtful or mindful of what we're doing. We tend to snack without thinking about it. And so keeping, self-monitoring, keeping a diary of what we're eating helps us develop an awareness for where we're going wrong in our diet, or when in the day maybe we're eating in excess, right? Or if we're stress eating. What kind of things are influencing the way we eat might also be something that we develop an awareness of with the diary. Same thing for behaviors for physical activity. Maybe, it really helps you to think of when you're being really inactive and not moving at all. So it helps you monitor your sedentary behavior or also your physical activity, right? Like, when are you more likely to engage in behavior, and how well am I doing in terms of increasing my steps? It's like, oh, today I wasn't very effective. Tomorrow I'm going to try better, right? It might be motivating in that regard. Okay, so self-monitoring, remember that one. Number one, behavior change technique for healthy eating and physical activity, but they found it was also really an effective technique for a lot of other behaviors, such as substance use. I forgot what else they had in there. I'm blanking now. Alcohol reduction. So substance use, smoking, alcohol, but also for monitoring when symptoms for irritable bowel syndrome. And so, it's an effective strategy, and so an important one to keep in mind when we're trying to do an intervention. The second most effective of the behavior change techniques for influencing healthy eating and physical activity was reviewing one's behavioral goals. Okay, so going back and reviewing one's behavioral goals after one has already established them, just to remind ourselves, what is it that I wanted to achieve, right? It's like sometimes we forget, or it's like, what did I say I was going to do? It's important to keep that in sight, right? To keep us motivated. The least effective behavior change technique for motivating healthy eating and physical activity was self-talk. So talking to oneself as you're planning to engage in the behavior or while you're engaging in the desirable behavior. So like, okay, Becky, today we're going to exercise. I'm going to exercise for 30 minutes. It's going to make me feel so good. And you're just trying to give yourself a pep talk in a sense. Not such an effective technique. Okay, so remember that. That's likely, these are likely to be exam questions. The second least effective strategy was time management, which to me was a little bit of a surprise. In terms of ineffective strategies, especially for things like physical activity and healthy eating. So sometimes, planning to eat healthy, it does requires you making that time, and definitely for physical activity, yet not such an effective strategy according to the reviews in table 3.1. Okay. Let me see, was there anything else I wanted to? Nope, that was it on that. Okay, so then they went on to describe which specific behavior change techniques that are commonly used to change health behaviors. And so they describe self-monitoring, again, one of our top-notch, right, type of interventions, behavior change techniques, motivational interviewing, which I have never really practiced, but the book gives you different tips on, what it is they try to do in motivational interviewing. And so I think they have like 8 or 9 steps in there that are characteristics of the therapist, and then also things that we try to influence in the individual using motivational interviewing. So I would pay attention to both of those, even though I don't list them here. They also talk about implementation intentions. And so what's the plan, right? This is the location where I'm going to apply this specific type of behavior. It's going to be on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, immediately after work. I'm going to the gym, there at work. Like you make a plan for how, when, why, everything, right? You predefine everything so that when it comes to being a Monday after work, that serves as your cue to engage in that behavior. So those if-then statements, right? If it's Monday after work, I'm going to exercise. Okay. And then incentives, just, rewards and punish. Well, in this case, rewards for actually completing the behavior, right? So some of the techniques don't require you to actually have completed any behavioral events. Others do. So for incentives, you first have to complete the behavior for that specific behavior change technique to be implemented. Okay, so let's go through each of them. Self-monitoring, what is it? Well, it's record keeping, right, for your target behaviors. How am I eating today? On a daily basis, you keep a little journal of that. How does it work, or how do they think it works? Well, they think it helps to increase awareness, as I was saying earlier. It serves as a cue to action, right? Okay. I didn't exercise today. Tomorrow I had to make sure I exercise, right? I was fat today. That's my cue to action. It helps to promote self-efficacy by keeping a diary. It's like, oh, okay, it increases my confidence. Like I was able to do 3 straight days. That's really good. And it might be motivating in that regard. And it also helps with problem solving by helping to identify when the behavior is more difficult to carry out. And then it helps to define what's going on around those times, and maybe helps one to engage in problem solving so that the next time they can engage in the behavior. And is it effective? Well, the summary of the literature suggests that yes, that for the most part they find around moderate or medium effect sizes, but in some instances they did find some large effects using self-monitoring as a behavior change technique. Regarding motivational interviewing, it tends to, what is it? It's a strategy designed to increase intrinsic motivation. So you're not relying on motivation from external factors. It's internal to you. It's like what is going to get you to do that behavior without relying on outside resources of motivation. It helps to reduce ambivalence toward engaging in a behavior. So like if you have pros and cons and stuff, it also helps to eliminate that ambivalence across engaging or not engaging. How does it work? There's a therapist trained in the strategy of motivational interviewing. It's not an easy technique to implement. There's lots of guides for how we conduct motivational interviewing. I participated in a training a long time ago. I don't think I can engage in effective motivational interviewing, so it does take some some training, and people should, be able to carry it out before actually going out and implementing it with the public. Let's see. So the therapist, it includes some therapist strategies and addresses some changes in the client. So that's the list of about 8 things that you'll find in your book. But it's believed to influence behavioral intention, self-efficacy, readiness to change, discrepancy between, awareness of discrepancies between where you want to be and where you should be. And then also it's supposed to engage the person in wanting to change. Okay. For this one, there's no clear-cut evidence, which I was surprised to see that, considering how highly people think of this strategy. So maybe the measures that are being used are not capturing what's happening with motivational interviewing. But in terms of actual behavior change, it was really mixed findings. Okay. But this strategy they use a lot with substance use, especially alcohol interventions. Short, brief alcohol interventions tend to implement this strategy of motivational interviewing. Implementation intentions. Again, what is it? These are if-then statements that identify the best time, location to take a specific action. Again, it defines exactly when, how, where you're going to perform the behavior. And how does it work? Well, it sets up cues for the behavior, right? So like, it's Monday, it's after work, that's my cue that I need to exercise. It strengthens the situation response relationship so that eventually it's just becoming more habitual to exercise at those specific times or given the cues that you've set up for yourself to exercise, so that they become more automatic and not so planned. And is it effective? Yes. They did find evidence that this was effective with medium to large effect sizes in terms of behavior change. Okay. And then finally, incentives. The desired behavior is rewarded, and this helps to reinforce the change, right? And it's based on operant learning theory by Skinner. So if you've had any classes in psychology, you might remember operant learning. How does it work? Well, the positive reinforcement or the reward will increase the likelihood of the behavior being repeated in the future. Okay. If you've studied operant learning, you know that different incentive schedules or different types of reward schedules tend to strengthen the occurrence of the behavior. So where you might start off rewarding someone every time they initially perform the behavior, eventually you'll start to withdraw the reinforcement and just give it intermittently to keep the behavior going. It works well in animal studies. I think it's been demonstrated with humans as well. Is it effective? It's effective in changing clinical behaviors, such as, if someone needs to get screened, giving them a small incentive, to do a one-time screening is very effective. But they find small to moderate effect sizes for changing substance use behaviors. Okay. So finally, they talk about different contexts in which we might want to target application of these behavior change techniques. And so, the contexts that they identified are where people spend a large time of their day. So children spend a large amount of time of their hours in which they are awake at school, right? Adults spend that time at work, at their work site. And then we also spend some time with our primary health care providers or in emergency rooms on occasion. And so for schools, they really tend to focus on those sites for physical activity interventions and interventions to reduce sedentary activity. And really, there's a large focus nationwide to try to reduce obesity. We know that obese children have a greater tendency to become obese adults. And so there's huge efforts, right? And that's why it's pretty acceptable to do some of these interventions in the schools. It also, other programs that were not listed in the book, but that I've seen are sex education. It's often delivered in the schools, and also nutrition education. Let's see, work site, again, 50% or more of our awoke hours are spent at work. Again, lots of physical activity interventions at the work site, and these tend to show positive effects not only in terms of promoting the behavior change or promoting physical activity, but also they are found to be effective in reducing stress, work-related stress, and absenteeism. Okay, and then ultimately, hopefully, the potential to reduce obesity. Primary health care and emergency rooms, again, these are great areas. These are great sites for kind of highlighting cues to action to behavior change. And so you can imagine someone who's been in a motor vehicle accident because of their alcohol consumption shows up at the emergency room. That's a time to intervene, right? That's a learning moment for them. That's a cue to action, or whatever you want to call it. And that's a time when they might be more receptive to participate in an intervention to help them change their behavior. Physician recommendations, right? When you go to the doctor for your checkup, it's like those physician recommendations are another cue to action, and they have a lot of influence on most people. Okay, if my doctor recommended it, I better do it, right? And also there's a benefit from using only brief interventions, because the primary care or healthcare not work site, the healthcare sites are busy, right? And they can't spend a lot of time in these long interventions. And so, if we can design really short, brief interventions that have a big punch or a big impact with the population of interest, that would be highly beneficial. So they made reference to the FRAMES program, which consists of feedback, responsibility, advice, a menu of options, empathy for the individual, and then promotion of self-efficacy to carry out the behavior. But there's other brief interventions, and so that's just one of them. We're actually doing a worksite intervention at Memorial Medical Center and Amador Healthcare Center. These are two centers here in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And one thing that's happening right now, especially with essential workers, is that they have very little time for their own self-care or prevention care. And so what we're trying to do is to partner up with these work sites to get people who are eligible to be screened for colorectal cancer by providing it at their work site and at no cost. And so there's a partnership here. We're implementing the health belief model to make sure people complete the colorectal cancer screening. And we're going to carry it out in October, and I'll let you know how that goes. Okay? All right, let's see. All right, so that was it for Chapter 3. Be on the lookout for the review that's coming. I'll post it a little bit later today. Chapter 4 should have been largely reviewed for you, focusing on behavior change theories, which is what we've been covering for the last 4 weeks. And so none of it should have been like totally surprising to you. But let's see. One thing I guess I wanted to review with you is what we mean by theory. And I think there's a tendency to forget what theory is. And so right now, right up, without looking it up, say it out loud. Tell me what you think a theory is. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it. What is a theory? What's a behavior change theory? Theory. Remember, when you think theory, think explanation, right? It's the explanation as to why the program is supposed to be working to change behavior. It's the explanation of why we expect the intervention to be effective, right? And some people are arguing that, do we really need these interventions to be theory-based? And I would argue that if you don't know what theory or what is the explanation as to why your program should be effective, I just think it's going to lead to poor program implementation. Okay, if you don't know how your program's supposed to work, what are the therapeutic components of your intervention, then how can you know how to apply the intervention correctly and make sure you don't leave out important components of that intervention? So to me, an theoretical intervention sounds like nonsense to me. It's like shooting in the dark. It's like, okay, I'm going to do this and it's supposed to work. But it's kind of like you're shooting in the dark. You're not really paying attention to what is the theoretical components of your intervention. And you can train someone to do something that's supposed to be effective. But again, if they don't understand what are the theoretical underpinnings of that intervention, it is likely they're not going to deliver that intervention correctly. They might have been trained initially, but eventually over time, their memory of how to do it or what's important about the intervention will erode. So it's really important that folks understand why their interventions are supposed to be effective. They should understand what that explanation is, right? It's the explanation as to why the intervention, what changes it's going to lead to that's going to eventually promote behavior change. Okay, so we'll talk about that again in a little bit. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this lecture. A lot of it is review. And so they revisit the theory coding scheme, which I think we covered in our very first lecture. I posted it again here, but it's in the same lecture for Chapter 2 in the Glance book and your other course textbook that we covered very early on in this semester. Okay, so these slides should look similar to you. And basically, it's just a scheme they use to examine whether a research article targeting some kind of behavior change intervention, whether to help identify whether it was theory-based. And it's kind of asks these various questions to see exactly what happened in the study. Was theory mentioned? Was theory used to tailor the intervention they're testing? Are the relevant theoretical constructs targeted in the intervention? Are the relevant theoretical constructs even measured? So you might be targeting, but you forget to measure them, and you only measure behavioral outcomes, but you didn't measure whether you influence those constructs with your intervention. Was the theory tested? Did they examine those mediation by the theoretical constructs of mediation of those behavioral outcomes? And did they refine the theory? Or did they go back and refine the intervention? Okay. Let's see. They did talk about the litmus test, but it was just the extent. It was just another kind of strategy for examining how theory is applied in the literature for behavior change interventions. So my main focus will be, you should know, on the theory coding scheme by Michie and Prestwich. So basically, the degree of theory use will be informed by, so the degree to which theory is used, sometimes the intervention is simply informed to some degree by theory. They make mention of it, but there's no real application. Sometimes the theory is actually applied to the development of the program, to designing the intervention. Sometimes theory is applied to the extent that the theory-based intervention is actually tested to see which of the constructs mediated behavioral outcomes following the intervention. And then it also can be used to build or create theory, okay, to refine theory. Is that it? Oh, I didn't capture these last slides, or I didn't print them out for myself. So theory-based interventions, they ask the question, is the intervention based on one theory or a combination of theories? Okay, so if a theory incorporates constructs from different theories, is it theory-based? Right, so if I took a construct from the theory of planned behavior and I took this construct over here from the help belief model, and then I took another construct from another theory, am I still conducting theory-based research? Perhaps if you are interested in the effect of those constructs and how they mediate behavior change, perhaps this new combination of constructs that you're targeting with your intervention is actually testing a new theory, one that's been previously untested, right? But you must have, if you're going to mix different constructs from different theories, you should have some kind of justification for doing so. Don't just be throwing things together without rhyme or reason, okay? Number 2, are all of a theory's constructs targeted by the intervention or just some? So that's an important question to answer, right? So I think a lot of you ask, do I have to target all of the constructs in the theory of planned behavior if this is the one I'm going to use to design my intervention? And I say yes, you should include all of the constructs from the theory of planned behavior, unless you have some justification for eliminating that construct. Okay, so perhaps it may be possible that everyone in your study has positive attitudes toward changing the behavior. That's a good attitude to have toward the behavior change. And there's not a lot of variability in that measure in terms of attitudes toward, say, cancer screening. Everybody thinks it's a good idea. It would be beneficial, right? It's a good thing to get screened for cancer, to make sure we catch it early or whatever the case. So just imagine everybody's on the same page. No variability, tiny standard deviations. The scores are already maxed. People are scoring a 7 on the 7-point Likert scale that, yes, screening is a good thing, right? In that case, you have justification for eliminating or for not targeting the construct of attitudes toward the behavior, right? But there should be some justification. You shouldn't just be dropping constructs because it's inconvenient to measure or to target. Okay. So if all constructs are included, then the behavior change technique should be incorporated to address each of those constructs. So assuming that we're including all of the theory of planned behavior constructs, so attitudes, social norms, um, perceived behavioral control, and behavioral intentions, right? So we have those 4 constructs. What are the behavior change strategies we're going to use to target each of those psychological determinants toward the behavior? Okay. So make sure that if you list the construct, you're describing how you're intervening to influence that construct. That's your behavior change technique, right? That's where the behavior change technique comes into play. Okay, so let's go on to number 3. It must be evident how behavior change technique is supposed to target a specific construct. And so this can be obtained from past research. So, what techniques have worked in influencing attitudes toward a specific behavior in a specific population. Okay, so you can look at past evidence and help formulate your rationale for using that behavior change technique to address that specific psychological determinant or a specific construct, in other words. Okay. It is really rare for this kind of detail to be listed in an intervention study, but it would be really helpful to do that, don't you think? Not only for your own research to identify what works but doesn't work, but also to help other researchers conducting future research on similar behaviors or on the same behaviors but with different populations. Okay, and then finally you need to test the theory. So make sure you examine the mediation effects. Do changes in the constructs lead to those changes in behavior? Okay, they also describe the 4-step cycle for developing and testing a theory-based intervention. I put texting, that's a typo. So step one is you want to use the best theory to identify determinants or constructs to target, okay? So which theory would be the best one to really address those determinants of behavior, those psychological determinants of the behavior, or even societal determinants of behavior, right? Depending on what kind of theory you're using. But right now we're focusing on the individual change, behavior change theories. So one, you want to examine, are there correlations between the constructs that I'm thinking of targeting and the actual behavior? Because if there's no relationship there, then you might be wasting your time. You might want to look at previous studies demonstrating a cause and effect between those specific constructs and the behavioral outcomes you want to target. So step 2, you want to identify appropriate behavior change techniques to target those determinants. So we just said that in the earlier slide, right? Each construct that you're targeting should have a specific technique incorporated in the intervention to modify that construct. So again, you want to look at the literature review to identify what specific behavior change techniques are most effective in influencing certain constructs. You can engage in educated guesswork based on your previous experience with those constructs or those psychological determinants. And you also want techniques theorized within intervention mapping. So those techniques, you might identify them, those believed to influence certain behaviors in intervention mapping. And again, I would look at that Cook et al. Article um, in the resources section of your Canvas module for this week. Okay. Step 3, you should use stringent methods and research methods and statistics to evaluate the intervention and to test the theory, right? So you want to be able to conduct mediational analysis to see, in fact, if your theoretical constructs were effective in influencing the behavior change. And then finally, you want to use the outcomes of that research either to refine the intervention or to refine the theory itself. So if the intervention did not modify the construct successfully, right? If your intervention didn't influence people's attitudes to the behavior or didn't influence their subjective norms toward the behavior or their perceived behavioral control to engage in the behavior, then your intervention or the specific behavior change techniques you implemented were not effective. And maybe you need to go back and rethink your intervention and refine it, right? Maybe incorporate some new behavior change techniques. If the intervention changed the construct, but it didn't change the behavioral outcome, then maybe that theory was not appropriate for your specific behavior that you're trying to influence. Or maybe some of the constructs did change as a result of the intervention and were somewhat related to the behavior, but maybe one construct had no influence at all. And so maybe there's something else. There's another determinant of that specific behavior that needs to be addressed. And maybe that's how you refine the theory, right? To identify that psychological determinant or a new construct that needs to be added to the other group to ensure successful behavior change. Okay, so let's see. Did I leave anything out? I think that's it. Okay. Okay, so a few of you asked questions regarding evidence-based interventions versus theory-based interventions. So when should we use an evidence-based intervention versus a theory-based intervention? And so I thought that was kind of, the way they answered it, I thought I would not have answered it the same way. And so an evidence-based intervention is an intervention that has been demonstrated to effectively change behavior, whether it be reducing risky behaviors or increasing healthy behaviors. Okay? And so that's all that means. It's shown or been demonstrated to be effective. And so basically, we use that term evidence-based interventions to interventions that are being promoted to be used with other populations because they've already been tested rigorously. And maybe they are theory-based intervention, but the new people adopting the intervention, this evidence-based intervention, are not aware of the theory that is guiding that intervention. And so I go back to my original statement, right? If you don't know what theory is guiding the evidence-based intervention and you're taking it and you're learning how to implement it, and then you're just going to do it kind of like in a very automated sort of way, this is how you're supposed to do this, so I'm doing it, right? But if you don't know or understand the therapeutic components of that intervention, what are the techniques that are important to influence those constructs to influence behavior change, that the likelihood that you're going to implement that evidence-based intervention correctly is reduced. Okay. Sometimes people do it exactly as they're trained to do, but they don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, or what it's meant to change other than the endpoint, the behavior change. Okay. But we become more ineffective implementers of interventions if we don't know how they are supposed to be working. So I thought, that they said, oh, if you don't need to know why it works, don't worry about it. You can go follow this theoretical approach. I don't need to know. I just know that it's effective. It's been proven to be effective elsewhere. And I think it's poor logic, especially when you're taking an evidence-based intervention. So many people have these canned behavior change interventions, right? And they provide all the steps. And you purchase it and you learn how to implement it, and you implement it, I would say, mindlessly, right? You almost automate it. And I think that's a huge mistake, because many times these evidence-based interventions are validated with very different populations. Oftentimes they're validated with non-Hispanic white populations, with populations that are of more privileged means, right, and resources. And so, an intervention that might work for one group might not work equally well for another group. So I would want to know exactly what was the theory of this evidence-based intervention, so I could see if those therapeutic components are being equally therapeutic in my new consumer group, whether it be a new racial ethnic group or a different age group or whatever type of group, right? As long as it's different from the original one with which the evidence-based intervention was validated. So just something to think about. It's just something that I disagreed with in the book. On the other hand, on the flip side, if you want to understand the underlying mechanisms, the constructs or the determinants of behavior, then it's important for you to engage in theory-based research and application of theory-based interventions. Okay, so I know that was a very long response. I didn't mean for it to be that long. I think that's it for today. Again, go read your assignment. I will set up the groups in the very near future so you can find them easily. But if not, you can go and look at the people link on the left-hand column of your Canvas page for this class, and then go and see on the top menu of that page, you'll see that there's groups, and there's one called PSA. And there, if you click on that, it'll do a drop down of all the different groups. And it might do a drop down of group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but just click on the group and then it'll drop down with the names of the people in that group. Okay? All right. Well, have a good day and good luck on the exam. Make sure you do some preparation. Don't go in blind. You have 2.5 hours to complete it. It's open book. And you have a week. So make sure you plan, make a plan, an implementation plan for the coming week as to when you will take the exam, okay? And plan to have 2.5 hours without interruption and working internet and working everything, okay? All right, thank you.